Mission Possible, where we explore the frontiers beyond individual scale. I'm Ann Braithwaite, a systems navigator, and I'm fascinated by the potential hiding within our systems. Unleashing that potential is the secret, I believe, to tackling our biggest challenges that are too vast for any solo hero to take on alone. Each week, I'm speaking with visionaries who've discovered that our greatest resource doesn't lie in individual brilliance, rather, it's the incredible capacity that exists between us all. Join us as we discover how to tap that potential by working beyond boundaries, beyond individual scale. This season, we're focused on the natural hazard sector, and living in New Zealand, it's a sector dear to my heart. After all, this is one of the most hazard-prone countries on the planet. In today's episode, our season finale, a special episode, we've brought back together a couple of our guests to talk about their missions possible and indeed think about all 6 that were presented over the series. If you haven't checked them out, do go back and re-listen to them or check out those you've missed. My guests Livia Hollins and Sam Ketley were fired up talking about how the intersects play out between their particular areas of interest and indeed all of those that our guests highlighted. In our own small way, we were trying to join up and address some of the silos in the system. So without further ado, here's our special panel episode. Very excited to welcome back to Mission Possible, Sam Ketley, Livia Hollins. Livia, Sam, welcome. We really enjoyed having our podcast with everybody, and we thought what a great idea it would be to bring a few of you back together to let's talk about some of those things that we serviced up, not least of which are 2 things in my head. First being everybody's various missions possible seem to me to stack nicely across the system, and wouldn't it be great if we could maybe make some connections around those and see what we might think about together. Secondly, was that without exception, everyone did talk about how we are siloed, and it is very, very, very common. Every sector I talk to, being siloed is an issue that comes up time and time again. And because we're all about harnessing the collective potential that exists in our systems and the people moving beyond our individual heroic actions to what we can do together and across our system, and we thought it would be really great to bring some of you back, as many as could, to be with us today and explore those ideas and see where the conversation goes. We're going to be really freeform today, but I'd love to just go back to meeting with you both. Give us a couple of words about yourselves, and perhaps you could lay out your mission possible as where we wrapped up for those who might have missed your episode. So I'm going to start with you, Livia, and then I'll come to you, Sam, and let's see, you can just remind us and maybe yourselves of what we talked about. So Livia, over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Kia ora tātou. My name is Livia Hollins, and I'm an international public servant. I have 20 years of experience working in climate change and sustainable development, including with the UNFCCC and also in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. In particular, getting SDG 13 operational and up and running. I'm from New Zealand, and it's a joy for me to now be back in New Zealand and working again as a public servant here in New Zealand. I'm the kind of person who loves working with systems and complexity, and I love your work on collaboration, and I find it super inspiring. And I think that we fall into this space sometimes of people who are thinking in systems of trying to figure out how to bring things back to some kind of structured way ahead. So I really appreciate your kaupapa today with weaving together all of the different moonshot ideas that we've heard throughout your podcast series, and thinking about how we can actually get some action on the ground in a tangible way to bring those ideas together. So my moonshot idea was the setting up of some kind of innovation hub around adaptation and natural hazards, this kind of work. It doesn't need to be super well defined in terms of the scope, but I think that the structure would come through working with innovative, agile type approaches to bring in all kinds of ideas, whether they're big or small, whether they are related to a specific part of an adaptation or natural hazards type piece of the process. It really doesn't matter. Any ideas, whether they have investment behind them or not, all would be welcome. The approach would be to run a process to look at which ideas have legs, could be scalable, and then the question of how to scale those ideas up and bring them together. And I think some of the other moonshot ideas already fit that sort of category. You can see the potential of where they could go. So that would be the concept. And I just wanted to point to a few other, situations where I've seen this kind of process in action. Just for some inspiration for us. So, for instance, the UN World Food Programme, who I've done a little bit of work with, they have such an innovation incubator that's based in Munich. There is a similar activity that the UN Climate Change Secretariat look after, which focuses on climate adaptation specifically. They're having, it's fantastic timing. They're having a conference in Christchurch in October. New Zealand is hosting this year. There's also the UNFCCC Resilience Hub. There's other technology competitions and awards on the UN side. So various other things. And I know of in New Zealand, there's an adaptation hub that's set up in the context of Auckland. But from my point of view, I think it would be great to see that expanded to a New Zealand-wide focus, picking up on some of the conversations we're having in academia and the public sector and also the private sector, bringing those together. And then extending that out to also include our Pacific neighbours. I think that there's so many cool people working in this space, so it would all be possible. And I think that this kind of approach could lift us from an incremental adaptation approach to a transformational adaptation approach, where we are actually acknowledging the systems that we're working with and that there are multiple moving parts, and actually they all need to shift as part of our response to climate change and adapting.
Livia, thank you. There's so much to unpack in there, and we'll come back to some of those points shortly, particularly how we might put some of our moonshots into your yet-to-be-created Adaptation Incubator Hub. So let's come back to those points shortly, but I'd love to pass over to Sam. So Sam, over to you.
Yeah, kia ora. Sam Ketley. My title is Head of Innovation for Commercial Risk Solutions for Aon across APAC, which is a lot of countries, obviously, and a very big title. So it's quite a broad role, but I'm very focused on built assets, built environment, and natural hazards predominantly. That's sort of my focus at the moment. But just as a way of background, I'm an engineer, originally from the UK, married a Kiwi, became a souvenir, fell into insurance before I got here, but continued my fall into insurance here. And basically that sort of understanding of engineering approaches, risk engineering, the risk transfer, underwriting, and sort of the financial piece means I've sort of bridged disciplines. And I guess what I bring here is there's always a commercial angle. And this is always a balance between the private and the public sector. And it's how do we incentivize changes in behaviors on both sides. And also, I think, engineering disciplines and finance disciplines often do operate in their silos. And I don't think we ever maximize at the moment the full value of one or the other. But this is the problems we're looking at sort of dealing with here are so complex. We have to look at a systems approach, and we have to look at the levers that are available. And some of those might be the fact that if insurance is starting to retreat, that's a very good lever. That means that finance is going to be unavailable potentially, which really drives decision making. So there's certainly ways that we can come together and think through the system and the process and look at ways that we can work together to sort of make changes which are going to be not just for us, but for our children and our children's children. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sam. Really appreciate that. So, Livia, I'd like to pop back to you now. You mentioned in your opening that you were seeing amongst our missions possible some potential for these to go into an adaptation hub. So I'm just going to remind listeners who may not have heard all of the guests, and if you haven't, I really encourage you to perhaps listen to the past episodes. But just to remind us all, we had the wonderful Ian White from Waikato University, and he talked about making an existing city resilient. And of course, we're not just going to start by building a whole lot of new cities in other places. We've got a whole lot of already committed spaces, places that we call home, places that people do not want to leave because this is where they have their history, their friends and their people. So he was really keen to talk about how could we make an existing city resilient. We'll move on to Michael Nolan, who's sadly sick, but he talked about that the existing SDG goals are great, and he named 3 more, but the one we really spoke about most was to drive resilient infrastructure investment. So we're consciously investing for the future. And Sam, I can see some overlaps there with what you were speaking about just now. Eric Bird laid out his vision about a systems approach and bringing the data and the science together with the investment sector and policies and better information about where and the land that we build on. So build on within existing cities and beyond, and also beyond the urban landscape. We need to also be really mindful of that interplay at the fringes of the urban and the rural landscapes. And finally, Erica Seville, who talked about modelling of information, bringing together private and public data. As she said, it sounds simple, but it is just so isn't. And to get that in the hands of individuals as well as organisations and entities so that we can make the decisions during recovery after a natural hazard event has happened so that people can make their best decisions for them. And we also explored within that how that widening of decision making during the recovery phase, we're not talking response here, but specifically recovery, increases the complexity of the system because you have many more people making decisions on all sorts of matters, as opposed to in a response where we kind of contain, for very good reasons, some of the decision making. So that's just a reminder of our 6 moonshots that we have already playing out. So with that reminder, I'll throw to Livia and just talk us through, Livia, some of your thoughts and reflections about the moonshots and how that might play out in an adaptation hub incubator. And Sam, please, we'll have a free flow here. Jump on in. Let's ask questions of each other and get to know how this goes. So we'll take a fairly fluid roll through this. So over to you, Livia.
Thank you. I mean, I think for me, the Innovation Incubator Hub idea comes from, sure, some inspiration in other places, but really bringing this and landing it in the context of New Zealand and then also our Pacific neighbours. When it comes to dealing with natural hazards and climate change adaptation, my understanding and from what I've seen in my experience is that there are a lot of good practices and lessons learned, things that we can generically bring together, but there's always a level of context specificity where in our circumstance here in New Zealand and or in the Pacific, we need to come up with our own solutions which work for us, and they're different, and they're going to be owned by us and meaningful for us. They could also be useful for other contexts overseas. But that level of context specificity, I think, lands us in the zone of we don't have all the answers, so we're dealing inherently with uncertainty. And my sense is that because we're inherently dealing with that level of uncertainty as humans, we like things to be comfortable and nicely mapped out. We like to have a clear way of dealing with risk, whether it's insurance or some other means as a backup plan. And when it comes to dealing with natural hazards and adaptation, in many cases, there's such a level of uncertainty. It's a little bit scary. We'll just put that over there. Even if we might have some really cool, interesting ideas in relation to what we could do there, it's that uncertainty that blocks us from taking the risk and bringing together the sort of wraparound support that you might need to actually address some of these complex issues. And they are complex issues because to actually meaningfully do things on adaptation, we need to take a systems approach. We need to have people who are from all sorts of different academic and public and private sector backgrounds, as well as community groups, people who are living, who may not be interested at all in doing anything on climate change, and yet they're being affected by the climate impacts of climate change on a daily basis. Maybe they don't even know this. All of the views are important, and particularly from vulnerable groups, Māori communities, women, people with disabilities, etc. So the concept with the Innovation Hub was actually to try and take away all of that risk in people thinking, I've got an idea. Maybe it's slightly crazy and I'm not quite sure how I can pull it off, but I think it could be meaningful to someone somewhere, and I'm not sure who to talk to about this, but I've got somewhere to land it. So that was the concept of the Innovation Incubator. And I do think that all of the ideas that have been suggested through your podcast and through this moonshot type approach would be really useful to speak more about those and connect people so that people can collaborate and talk more about how to get these things off the ground.
Sam, reactions?
That's always where to start. Yeah. Wow. Okay. All 6 people that have provided some input, coming at the same problem slightly different ways. Obvious overlap, obvious need for innovation, and some way of sort of getting a steer on that. My concern with those groups is always that they can become talk fests. So I'm always very keen to see people who are proactive and with end goals in mind and actually driving it to some sort of outcome and result. Otherwise, I'm not sure how much time, how much benefit you get for the time spent. So that's just my general concern about those. But it's interesting, I thought Erica's comment around taking the opportunity during recovery is an interesting one, and something that we're looking at as well, in the way that that's when things are broken already. That's when you can fix it and build back better, as they say. The problem you've got is that, and this is part of the systems approach, if you look at traditional insurance is about reinstating what's just been destroyed or damaged. So how do we sort of overcome the inherent situation where an insurance policy generally requires you to reinstate what you've just lost? So there's some real general thinking that we need to this is why it's a systems approach, and we all need to sort of come together, but go back to our own individual disciplines and start working with people to come up with solutions to fix things. One of the opportunities that we have, and I think specific to New Zealand, is something that we should leverage, is the level of information that we've had from some very severe events that have impacted in New Zealand, which allow us to understand cause and effect more clearly than probably anywhere else in the world at the moment, specifically around not just climate change, but particularly earthquakes. The opportunity is that we need to be looking at getting across the silos in New Zealand, because we've got fewer people here. We should have a smaller, shorter decision chain, able to get to the right people in order to sort of let them understand how the data informs the decision making and the cost benefit. But if we're able to do that in New Zealand, I think there's a massive opportunity here to actually say, let's export that. I see that as the reason why there should be time and investment in this, because people are looking for solutions, and it's complex for New Zealand. Can you imagine what it's going to be like in a bigger, more developed country with more stakeholders in play? I think we've got a way of hopefully coming up with solutions which are then exportable to other people. And I think that in a way should maybe be the incentive for participation, because at the end of the day, there's goodwill. And I think we obviously have to look after the people that are going to be most affected by climate change and other natural catastrophes. And that's often the poorest parts of community. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to who pays, who's most impacted. So we've got to tie in the financing and the funding, as well as I hate to say it, the profiting and commercialization of this. If you want to make that change, it can't be done just on a charity basis. So I just think we've got to sort of balance those things. But I think there is a huge opportunity in New Zealand with where we are at the moment, with what we've experienced, and how we can leverage that through great science, engineering, product creation, and then look to export that and become innovation hub for the rest of the world, especially. And there's some great countries that are very innovative, but they do not have the volcanic risk. They do not have the earthquake risk. So we've got this opportunity as a country to really use the problems that we face as a way of driving the solutions that we can provide to us.
Sam, just thank you for sharing that again, as you opened with a lot in that. So I wonder if I could take you up on a couple of points, and Livia, please jump in as well. A couple of things you talked about was just the way the insurance market works at the moment with the rebuild back what was there before. I wondered if you could share with us any insights that you've got around, is that shifting in the sector? Is it not? What might that look like? And the second question would be around that decision chain. I think we were talking briefly before we came on about you've seen some significant shifts since you and I first crossed paths a number of years ago. We won't mention that just to protect the guilty, how long that was. But perhaps you could just highlight a couple of those things for us. And then, Livia, I'd love to get your reflections on what Sam was talking about.
The first question there was around the inherent issue around insurance and the requirement to, so a basic tenet of insurance is, well, there's several, but one of them is it's unforeseen, which is a problem in itself, where we're starting to see these events are likely to happen or going to happen. So the unforeseen component is an inherent issue that insurers treat with, and you'll see it with retreat and always as of controlling their risk. But the inherent way an traditional insurance policy works is you declare a value. That value is the limit of what will be paid out. And if you need to adapt and change, You either need to get that pre-agreed or you're then limited or hamstrung. And so the inherent insurance policy is restricting what options are available. And you see some worst case examples. Actually, in Hurricane Katrina, there was a requirement for some of the pump stations which were lost during the event, and they had to rebuild exactly what they just had destroyed. There was no opportunity to revamp at the time because of the regulations that were in place. And that's an inherent issue. So that's traditional insurance, and there's definitely a discussion to be held with insurers around how can we introduce flexibility in the response. That in itself introduces uncertainty and is potentially open to abuse by unscrupulous people, which is always a problem. But there are alternatives. So there may be more freedom to operate with the newer insurance products like parametrics, which are basically triggered by a parameter, wind speed, earthquake shaking, whatever the parameter is, and then a payout, almost automatically a payout if the threshold is met, and the money is paid out as a lump sum. There is less control and less requirement to build exactly, or there's no claim settlement process. It's the lump sum is paid. So that would be potentially more freedom to, as long as the entity can say that they've suffered loss, that would give more freedom to operate in what you do to build back better. The question would be, what do you build back? To what standard and where, and is it even feasible? And again, that's where the pre-planning and the engineering disciplines working with the insurance disciplines to quantify it pre-loss, agree it pre-loss, and then allow that freedom to sort of eventuate post-loss. The other thing as well is, and I think, Livia, you mentioned this, was the uncertainty. We hate uncertainty. We deal with that in insurance all the time. And that's one of the things we can actually bring as a strength. We deal with uncertainty in the way we model risk. I just don't think our solutions and how we then allow a treatment of that risk is sufficient and adequate. And that's probably where the Innovation Hub would come in and be helpful in what would actually be feasible and realistic and financially viable for risk carriers, for the insurers. But yeah, there's definitely these are sort of systemic problems that we need to look at. But the other part of it is up front is making sure that we stop building in stupid areas, using land that's really appropriate, because it's nice and flat and easy to build on. So there's two parts to this. There's definitely what's already built, but also preventing ongoing problems for the future.
I'll open up to Livia and I'll come back to the second question just to give you a chance to draw breath. Livia, what's popping up for you with all of that? We can see some linkages.
Yeah, it's brilliant and super, inspiring. I agree with Sam that we do have all of the conditions here in New Zealand, I think, to be really successful, in particular for the private sector to exploit the opportunities for building new markets and profit making, and for prosperity in the context of working in the climate adaptation space. And I also think that, New Zealand is famous for being nimble and taking this number 8 wire approach and making the connections and working in an informal way. So those are all huge advantages, actually, when it comes to being able to be a fast mover on climate adaptation type things. I think that also I know so many people who are involved in adaptation things. It's definitely a groundswell that's growing. And my sense is that just picking up on what you were speaking to, Sam, in terms of the current system being sort of geared, including insurance, towards rehabilitation and reinstatement of our current business as usual operating system. I think actually what we need is to make climate adaptation stuff, the way we deal with natural hazards, the new normal. So it's in a academic or climate sort of speak context, this would be then called mainstreaming, but that's our new normal. And I think that there are conversations being had in the context of the UN climate change negotiations on loss and damage about actually how to do this, how to change. We've basically set ourselves up in a situation where we are driving in one direction and we have all of the guardrails and the cushions set up to help us keep driving in that one direction. And now we have a changing landscape and a changing context. We need to take some of those things away and allow ourselves some flexibility to drive in maybe this direction sometimes, but maybe also that direction. So it's a bit of a tricky thing, but there are conversations being had. And I know that Munich Re are also a player in that sense. Of course, Sam can speak more to reinsurance as well. But I think that the concept of having New Zealand as a test bed for this is a really interesting one. in terms of how we bring together the massive expertise. And I agree with you, Sam, you're right. The massive expertise we have in understanding cause and effect and understanding long-term systems, but responses to immediate climate impacts, extreme weather events that happen, and earthquakes as well. I think there's a lot in the DRR space that links to what we're speaking about here.
Thanks, Livia. Sam, I'll throw to you to just talk a little bit more about what you might have seen evolving over the last 10 years or so. We were saying just before we came on that you can see some shifts, particularly we were talking about information passing through a system, and then I'll come to you, Livia. The flow of information across the silos into the decision makers' hands, what I keep hearing is we know so much already. We have deep expertise across the country. We've also got a DNA that says we'll use informal networks well. That can be a great boon, but it can also be our downfall because we don't formalize those. We don't make them more robust. We don't make them more sustainable beyond individual relationships that happen to go way back. So I'm really interested, Sam, about what you're seeing as we improve some of that over the years and what we might learn from that to take forward, experiments that you've been part of, processes that you've seen working or not working, and the same for you, Livia. And perhaps to just get you guys to tic-tac directly without me in the middle to see where we go with that. So Sam, over to you first.
Yeah, I think one of the areas that we're seeing sort of stepping up of what's happening within the central government space is the sort of the broadened remit of what was EQC is now NHC. And that makes absolute sense. And then on the top of that, there's a Treasury initiative around sort of a centralisation of risk financing for the public sector, which again, on the face of it, makes absolute sense. There's lots of opportunities of economies of scale and standardization. And if the ultimate insurer in this case is really the New Zealand government, the balance sheet of New Zealand as taxpayers, it makes sense that there are more controls in place to sort of leverage good risk management and practices throughout the public sector. And it makes absolute sense that the Treasury has a view of risk for New Zealand for a range of hazards for all that they're responsible for, from the residential portfolio, which is covered under NHC, to all our prisons, police, fire, roads, rail, you name it. Ultimately, we as taxpayers and they as the government manage it on our behalf. So I see that as being a very positive development and hugely potentially influential. But I think the other side of that is, okay, so if you understand the problem better, great. But what are the solutions that are going to actually help with overcoming this problem of the insurance policy, which is an annualized placement? These problems are long tail, and so how do we make changes which allow policy to be more adaptable, long term, so that, and there's things against products that are coming out which will improve that. But then also, how do we demonstrate the long-term financing and benefit and the insurer's acceptance of physical risk mitigation? How do we model that to demonstrate the value add for protecting some communities? And then how do we deal with the reality is we can't protect everywhere. So how are we going to enable retreat and re-establishment of communities elsewhere? It's great that once we understand the problem, but in a way that just creates more issues. But we have to do that. We've got to start somewhere. And so I do think we're seeing some really positive signs. Hopefully that Treasury initiative gains legs and gets ministerial buy-in, and we'll see where it goes. Because if we don't have that, I'm concerned about how we overcome some of these issues between different policy regimes and differences in the policy space between central government and local government. And then, how does central government engage with local government? How do they all engage with the private sector, be it the engineering, design, land use planning, land planning, development, us providing insurance, and the finance sector providing the finance? So we're going to need some pretty sort of big picture thinking people be involved who are willing to sort of work together to come up with some solutions here.
I can jump in just listening to what you're saying, Sam, and sort of stepping back from that a little bit, because I'm not an insurance expert. I think when I listen to you, I hear you talking about making good decisions and ensuring that we are investing in the right places. Yeah. And I think that insurance absolutely is a part of that. But of course, what you're saying is that, of course, it's bigger than that, because we're talking about whole system stuff, and we're talking about transformational system stuff. And I think that in a way, we're sort of fortunate with climate adaptation because there's a level of predictability that we bring to this. So we can do the short term, the medium term, and the long term planning to some extent. And I also think that there's a level of how do we look at this as a collective and ensure that we're making the right decisions and investing in the right places for the collective good. But also there's a level of, let's bring this right back down to the individual. For you and I, how do we know? We've all got bank accounts and investments and interests, and we want to be making good decisions as well. How do we know that we have the information that we need to be able to make good decisions and be investing in the right places? And then what does that add up to for our families and our legacy moving forward? And I think that the other part of that question is considering where do the costs fall. So thinking about the Treasury work that you're talking about, there's an interplay where the costs fall, as I see it, between who takes responsibility for things and the data and information and knowledge that's available. As in, if we have more data and knowledge available, maybe we then won't be interested in building our house in a risky place, for instance, versus not having that knowledge. We think it's going to be lovely having a sea view, but that's not the best thing for our children's inheritance, perhaps. And then when it comes to thinking about how we bring all the pieces together and move this forward, and I'm really interested in drawing you in on this and hearing your views on collaboration and how we can make good use of collaboration tools. I think that's really a key to unlocking how we move forward and how I think we're in this formation stage with adaptation and natural hazard stuff in New Zealand. And I think that the collaboration piece is really a key to unlocking that and helping us to then move forward.
Thanks. I'll respond to that in a moment as by way of wrapping up. But Sam, anything you want to chip in response to that quickly, and then I'll take us
very, very quickly. So I think the education piece is really interesting. Having two young daughters going through school at the moment, yeah, it's great to see that they're sort of introducing financial education for people to be more aware of financially going forward. I think it's great. The problem we've got here, and it's an inherent problem for most sectors, is, we're meant to be experts in our field, and hopefully we all are, but, how do we convey really complex problems and complex solutions in really simple ways that are easy to understand? Especially in the current climate that, unfortunately, in some countries where, science and the truth are nominal, which is a real issue. So that's an inherent issue. But I do think that, there are definitely smart ways coming out around how we can convey messages to people. And I do think that the events of 2023 and what we're seeing around the world is really making people sort of question, is this real? And I think most people would say, yeah, the climate is changing. We've got a problem. We need to do something. So I think in some ways that can be quite easily overcome. But there's definitely an education piece about how do we convey things without scaring people and helpfully. But I think one of the things I can see about the insurance sector is an opportunity, and I do mean sector. You mentioned a market. We need to be looking at the market more widely than a single or a few insurers. It needs to be a sector transition and insurers collectively, although then you've got to make sure that it's not anti-competitive as they're all doing the same thing. So we've got to create the marketplace. But the key thing there is that the opportunity does come apparent that the insurance piece can be easily very much a stick or a carrot for change. And that would be very incentivizing for people if they understand in a few years you will not have insurance for your property, which means the value is likely to plummet because no one is going to be able to get finance for it. I think that would be quite a way of incentivizing behaviors, making sure that if people want to develop in certain areas, there's not going to be insurance available, therefore maybe rethink your strategy. So I think there's an opportunity to use insurance as the canary in the mine, for want of a better phrase, to sort of say, and I think it would be, the insurers would appreciate that as well, because they're wanting to be long-term sustainable and profitable themselves. So that would be helpful. But it all, at the end of the day, comes down to, for better decision, it's where is value being lost and who pays. And I think that we need to sort of hold on to that, because ultimately that will inform decision making about what people do, is ultimately who's carrying the risk and who pays. And if we as taxpayers are seeing that money's being squandered by poor investments, by poor defence works or whatever, then obviously then we would make decisions at the ballot box. Everything's linked. But yeah, those are sort of the key things that respond to that.
Sam, perhaps I'll maybe start to close us out with the following thoughts. So where value is lost and who pays. I think, Sam, you had a particular possibly idea in your head on value at that point in terms of, dollar value, etc. But we can take it in its widest sense of where value is lost and who pays. And I think that's bringing us nicely back to two aspects of collaboration. I've just been up to the Northland Emergency Management Forum last week where I was speaking, and I was deeply inspired by the collaboration efforts that are going on up there to help communities taking their own agency, if you like, to develop, respond, recover, and work through future ways of working that they will bring together. And it was bringing together their local and community knowledge and networks together with advice from more formal advice from various experts and various across the sector and related sectors. And I really took heart from that. I could see when the information was in people's hands, and then to your earlier point, Livia, they were making the most of it for their own context. What is appropriate in the far north is not the same as what would work in central Auckland. So taking those basic tools, keeping the messages clear and succinct, but also bring those tools and getting them in the hands of others and working with them in their own ways in their own communities. And I think that plays all the way through to in their own ways in their own communities can apply equally to academia, to cities versus urban, to business, large and small. I think we need to think of that as a grounding principle that works across that, which brings me back to collaboration. So collaboration is principles-based, not rules-based. So if we can have a whole bunch of guiding principles that support some of the areas where rules need to apply, working to principles gets us a lot further in complex spaces than working to rules ever does. Sam will know I'm a great believer in the non-talk fest. This goes back to our first crossing of paths. And I said to Sam, do you want to talk about the problem or do you want to do something about the problem? And I said, right, let's bring that number down by 2/3 and we'll get them in a room together, because only when we have certain numbers can we have really concrete discussions. Now, that's not to say large dissemination of information forums are not useful. They are. If we are wanting, however, to start to trigger some action, we generally need to start smaller and with a much tighter group and then scale out and widen and deepen our reach as we go. So to the principles around collaboration, Livia. For us on our moonshots, we have 6 guests. We have 6 guests who now vaguely know each other by virtue of being on this podcast if they didn't know each other before. And now you two have had a bit of a richer conversation than maybe you ever would have had. I'm going to reach out to all of you and see where we can find. I always say start with 3 to 5. There's a reason there were 6 guests. 3 to 5. What might you trigger together? What might we say? Let's find a shared ambition. Systems are big. They're gnarly. They misbehave. When you poke them in one place, they pop out somewhere else that you weren't expecting. But what's great about systems is it doesn't matter where you start in the system, it will flow through to the rest of the system if it's the right thing. If it's something the system needs and wants, it will flow through. So I encourage us all to think big, but start small. Think big ideas, think grand ambitions, and then start with a smaller coalition of the willing and able. There are a lot of willing people, but they're not necessarily able. They don't have the networks. They don't have the budgets or resources of some kind, whether that's energy, time, spaces. They might not have decision-making ability within their sector or influence. So we need the willing and the able. The willing but not yet able will come along later. So that's where I say to people, start your missions possible at the place where you have the most ready impact right now, where you can actually take a first step, the first step on a 1,000-mile journey. But you take that first step and take it together. And as the old proverb goes, we will go further and faster together. And as I advocate for, within our systems, we have so much latent capacity that's actually lying around. This is a hard message to hear right now. We feel so resource strapped and time strapped. But when we come together, much like when we come together for a potluck dinner in this country, although we didn't have much in our fridge when everyone arrived, we always have way more left in the fridge when they've all left. And that's a potluck dinner. Everyone went home full. Everyone took home leftovers and my fridge is full. I don't know how that happens. Barbecues are the same. So let's imagine that we have more in our system than we can possibly imagine. We have more knowledge, we have more time, we have more resources. If we bring those together, we can make our missions possible. So it just leaves me to say thank you to Sam and thank you to Livia, and any last words or remarks from either of you.
Just from my side, such a pleasure to speak with you, Anne, and be part of your Mission Possible podcast series. And I just love the kaupapa of this, really. I think that it's very easy to feel a bit negative about dealing with climate change, adaptation, natural hazards type things, but we've got so many positives we can draw from to help us to move forward. And building a community of practice, building stronger networks across sectors in a collaborative sense is so important. We've got to be all in on this, and we've got to keep people at the centre and keep moving forward in a positive sense. So thank you.
I think that's a wonderful wrap up. I've got nothing else to add. I think that's spot on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you to Livia. And we'll see you all here next time on Mission Possible for a whole new series soon to be announced. Well, what an exciting end to our series. I've so loved series 1 of Mission Possible. We've had 6 amazing guests. I just have in my mind, what would it be like if all of those Mission Possibles were actually made into reality? They became possible. I believe they are possible. If you're listening to any of these podcasts and you'd love to contribute to any of those ideas, please reach out and we'll make connections for you. Once again, Mission Possible, we can do it when we come together. When we go beyond the individual, I don't believe there's anything we can't do. I believe our potential, our capacity that's already in our systems is just waiting for us to get a hold of it. And as you will have heard in all the old ways, new ways snippets, if you've been listening to the other podcasts, we can look back to the past and learn things. We've already solved these problems in one way, shape or form in the past using different technologies. We can do it again. I truly believe that. And I look forward to hearing your reactions and comments to the podcasts. So that's a wrap for season 1. Later in the year, stay tuned. Season 2 is coming your way, and I think it's going to be just as exciting. I'm Ann Braithwaite, and this has been Mission Possible. Thanks for joining us. We love having you here.